Welcome everybody. We're going to be studying tonight the 10 parables, parable 3, Triangularity. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion on this one. As it's built on prior parables, it seems as though each week gets a little deeper and a little more profound. And I personally am getting more out of it, and I think that the discussions are likely going to continue to uncover even more deep nuggets. Jeff Savage is going to be leading the discussion tonight, and at this time, I'll shoot it over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Perfect. I'm going to share my screen with you all. While I do so, I want to just say that I'm presenting to you from my virtual beach. If you look behind me, this is a drawing my wife, or my wife, my daughter made. So she would love to be at the beach, but we can't. It was her birthday today, so we're doing what we can. Okay, so getting started with this parable, just in terms of overall questions, things that I would like us to be thinking about. I had that list up, or I sent that list out on Covenant Chat with a few questions to think about. The first one that struck me was, how does this parable relate to possible lessons learned in the temple and, of course, our personal journey, return to God? That's kind of an overall question that I think, if that's in your mind, if you're keeping that up at the top of your mind, then it's easier, at least for me, to kind of see what some of these symbols could mean. And at least for me, they feel very significant if I'm going that way. Okay, so that being said, I think we will find our way into some of the surface level meanings as we go along. And so we'll kind of just get started with where we are here. There was a time when all the world agreed the ancient triangle to be the great symbol of truth and God. Although it was just an ancient relic, mankind thought it contained the complete expression of truth. So just as a softball, maybe question, do you agree that the triangle is the great symbol of truth and God? And how in the world, was there ever a time where the world all agreed on something? Those are kind of my two big questions in this paragraph. Anyone have any thoughts?
So, I'll throw out my thoughts. I'll answer those probably in reverse. Was there ever a time when everyone agreed? Maybe when there was just two people on the earth. But even then, maybe not. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I would probably say no, because we all have different experience and different perspective, different understanding of things. That doesn't necessarily mean one is right and another is wrong, but just having a different understanding means we might disagree on things. So then the other question, in my opinion, is the triangle, the great symbol. I would say no. I'll leave it at that. Let's have other people talk.
I have a thought, Jeff. In the post-apostolic period, can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
In the post-apostolic period, there was a Mathene church and a Pauline church and a Petrine church and a Johannine church, and they persecuted, punished, destroyed, banished anybody who didn't believe the way they did. And then Constantine called a council, and everybody agreed. Everybody agreed. Whether you agreed or didn't agree, you agreed. And what was it over? The bizarre nature of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's the, at least at some level, that's the surface meaning. And whether the agreement was enforced or voluntary, the parable doesn't quite say. And again, all the world often when the scriptures talk about all the earth or all the world, it's a very localized, meaning. I think, and at least that's another way to be kind of thinking about it. But yeah, so I agree with you, McKay. I think that's at least you could think of the Godhead as one thing that everyone agreed on. I also had thought about the Bible. So at some period, right, at some time around there, all the world also agreed on the Bible as the complete expression of truth, as the word written down, right? The word come down from God. So those are the only two kind of, at least surface level, meanings that I could kind of get to for the great symbol of God and of truth. And again, other questions. This is kind of a more pointed, direct question, and I lead out with those because I feel like they're easy to start going, and then we can get to the better questions as we move on.
So Jeff, can I ask you a question then?
Yeah.
So I want to change your question 5 to, do you agree the triangle is a great symbol of truth and God? Because I think part of what led them down the path they were led down was they thought it was the one, as opposed to a great symbol. Because it's well, I guess we'll read some more perhaps here in a little bit, but the things that they found from the symbol seemed good. These weren't bad things that they were trying to come out with. But when that context changes from a to the, it can be a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to get at that with question 7 as well, but well, maybe even 16. But yes, I think that's probably the beginning of the end, right? For this group on their journey for truth is their willingness to say that this is the symbol of truth, as if the unity of God, right? This great thing that we have a hard time understanding, not because it's not understandable, it's just God is perfectly just and merciful, which is it's hard to understand, right? He pursues judgment. He also is kind and generous, and you put all these characteristics of God in together, and God somehow makes them all work. And it feels like it's humanity's tendency to say, no, but God is love. Like, he's this thing. Let me take the oneness of God and this eternal thing and put it down to one mindset, right? One word or one idea, whether that's, the Godhead, and here I have this council, we all agreed on these 50 words, or it's the Bible, right? Here is the word, and we can now put a box around it or a symbol. That does seem to be our, Gentile mindset, one of our big issues. Is there a comment? Oh, sorry, I heard something. Anyway, so I agree. I think I agree that that's a big issue.
Jeff, I was just going to add, it was interesting to me that it became all about the symbol, the triangle, and the whole point of the triangle was to teach people of God and who he was, to be the perfect depiction of teaching people who God even is. And it became all about the triangle, and the triangle became a idol for them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it's as if, this narrowing God down to a thing that you can look at, an image, right? Because an image doesn't have to necessarily be a picture. It can just be a symbol or a thing, that this thing is God, right? And of course, that's not how it starts off. And I love how it's like, although it was just an ancient relic, Mankind thought it contained the complete expression of truth.
And it was so interesting how, there were dissertations and all sorts of wisdom given for this triangle. And it became a source of contention.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and just, in case anyone's thinking about it, don't get a doctorate. Don't do a dissertation. But yeah, Libby, some of the great symbols or some of the great meanings you see throughout all the rest of the parable as well. Look at how it points upward. It shows how man was meant to reach up to and seek after the approval from God. So there's definitely a pretty profound meaning there. And you can see it goes all the way to the very end of the parable, where this symbol was always meant to get you looking up, right? And looking up and meeting God. Any thoughts on the triangle as a symbol? Things that stuck out to you that were significant?
So it really struck me a couple of things. The idea, it's first identified as an ancient relic. And a relic in and of itself is an object surviving from an earlier time period. So this is already gone through a period of apostasy. And now a symbol is essentially a representation of a relic. It's a copy of a representation or of a copy. It's you're getting many degrees away, many iterations away from the original. And it really struck me that just how representative this is of where we find ourselves, and looking around and seeing truth as echoes in everything that has tried to maintain their copies of copies of copies of copies throughout history. And we see truth all over the place because of that. But all of it lacks the entirety, the original actual understanding, the actual light and truth, the actual intelligence and knowledge. And so that really struck me this week in pondering this.
Mm-hmm.
Can I share a thought? As Wendy and I read this together, I think the thing that struck me is that we really all are just approximating in our understanding of the character of God. And so, as we progress, we're a triangle, we're a square, we're a pyramid, we're all just trying to figure it out. And I think it's important to stay humble and just realize I don't have it figured out, even though I might have more knowledge now than I did a year or two ago. I really am only that much closer. I'm just scratching the surface of understanding the nature of God.
I got a comment. Am I on?
Yeah, go for it, Jared.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess just with the triangle and temple-ish things, I guess most obvious coming to my mind are the marks from the garment stuff, which to me was, and I don't know, I think someone early on gave me the idea that all that comes from masonry, and where there's really, you could say 3 or 4 basic instruments that you can use to precisely build a house. And those are like the compass, which is like the form of a triangle. You can make perfect circles with, a square for exact corners, a plumb bob to be able to hang directly up and down, and a ruler. So anyway, those are kind of the basic instruments that you could use to build like a perfect temple. If you have those, then the quality of what you're going to be able to build greatly improves. So that's like, to me, one of the arms or legs that you can use to be able to build something. Not everything that you need, but there's a lot there. So anyway, as far as thoughts on the triangle and stuff. That was just something.
This has probably already been said. I missed the first 8 minutes, but to me, the triangle was just obvious. The Trinity, the concept of God is like, as they saw the triangle, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And I love how it progresses we see more angles of it, more sides of it, and we realize there's a whole lot more there than we originally thought. Anyway, to me, that was the obvious surface. And like I said, it probably already was said. Sorry about that.
We won't kick you out yet, Brian.
I think too, it's interesting, kind of what Marie had brought up or said, when we talk about the triangle, it's easy to focus on the object itself, even that it represents an object. I mean, the parable itself is called triangularity, not triangle. And when I think of triangularity or triangulation, right, it's not an object, it's a process, right? And so it's the fact that this object, and we tend to look at the object as representing another object rather than the object representing an action or a process or a path, right? With triangulation, you have different points that all lead to one overall truth.
Yeah. So do you see this as a personal path, or are you seeing it more as this is the path of mankind towards understanding God?
Well, I think it can be both, right? I mean, in the parable itself, like, I think it represents like a path for mankind, right? The different stages and what they're going through. And I think that can represent the path in each of our lives. That can represent the path for everyone. I mean, when you want to look at it with the representation of the temple, it's kind of the same thing, right? The temple had these symbols, but these symbols were a process, like the steps that we needed to take or that we need to take in order to come to know God, to fully know Him, to know the true symbol.
Yeah. Marshall, you had a thought that you wanted to share too, it sounds like.
I sort of already did. I just think of the triangle and a hierarchy, and it fits perfectly well with the Trinitarians were pretty hierarchical.
Yeah, they definitely were. The hierarchy comment made me think about another potential meaning, which is, we could think of this as starting, and granted, the parable's not, this is definitely a misapplication, but I feel like you can almost think of it as starting with us today, well, I've got my BYU shirt on, right? Starting at the quintessential, BYU or BYUI or little LDS kid or young couple. And we know what truth is, right? We've got it all. We've got things figured out. The hierarchy kind of fits to a lot of ways in that it's almost like you think of the triangle and we're pointing into, we've got truth and we can narrowly define it. We can talk about it in this narrow way because we've got it figured out. At least if you think of the triangle pointing outwards from us.
Jeff?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Another thought on why 3 became such a kind of magical number. The Christian concept of Trinity arose out of a Greek world where they had a whole branch of mathematics called trigonometry related to the triangle. Not the square, not the pentagon, not the octagon. It's interesting that they would have a branch of mathematics that is founded on the triangle. It's so odd, really. And we come from a Christian background, so this idea of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost isn't that big a deal. But according to Margaret Barker, it was the Father and the Mother and the Son. This was their threesome: the Father, the Mother, and the Son. And there was a mercy seat that had 2 seats, one for the Father, one for the Mother, and then on the other side of the tabernacle was the golden calf seat. representing the sun. I don't know how much of that's true, but it's interesting that 3 became so important to the Greeks before it became important to the early Catholics.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the parable hints at some of that idea, right? Sciences were advanced from the benefits of studying the triangle. Over time, whole libraries are written on the subject of the triangle. Society itself advanced, and it was a universal proclamation of united mankind that God's greatest gift was the triangle. Yeah, we can definitely see the Trinity. I feel like that's the most obvious, clear idea. Though I think if you look at the Bible in a similar way, it's similar, right? Because more and more people learned how to read, more and more people learned how to think. They, of course, what we're going to get to, things change a little bit more. One of the big questions that I have, because it's a hard question for me, is how do we guard against this, or how do we guard against this idea that's highlighted on the screen, that as in all manners in which there is uniformity of opinion, however, men began to question whether others held sufficiently orthodox views of the great triangularity. Really expecting Jill with her, like, I have a very different view of the world, to come in and save us.
It's so funny that you say that, because I was currently texting Cameron to show him a picture to see if he would be able to fancy pants it on the screen, because I don't know how to do that. But maybe I can just hold it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
You probably ought to send it to Jeff, since he's already sharing his screen, Jill.
Okay, I'll send it to you, Jeff, just a second.
Okay.
So the thing that I just sent you stands out to me. These are the 7 chakras, and it doesn't answer your question that you just presented, but it was the thing that I was doing when you were talking. It represents the 7 chakras in yoga, or in Hinduism. And if you look, if there's a way for you to pop them up there, you'll see that the triangle is in lots of them, but also then you'll have triangles and circles, and then also you'll have triangles and circles and squares in every single one of the chakras. And so to me, what I found, and like this just now came to me, even though I had read the chapter earlier today, I just now started to realize that in yoga, in Hinduism, I guess, because it's off the Hindu tree, in yoga, the triangle, the square, and the circle are all represented in the chakras. So there you go. That's what I got. You'll see that you have all of the arrows are pointing down, right? So at the bottom you have the red one. That's the Muladhara. That's like the grounding down. That's why the arrow is down to the earth, because it's supposed to just like bring you down into your earthly time that you're down here, right? And then at your heart chakra, the green one, you have the arrow up and the arrow down. So it's just like the Star of David, right, in the middle. And so it's just interesting to me, because I would think that on the purple one, which is the Ajna, your third eye chakra, it seems to me like it should be an arrow pointing up, right? I mean, this is just what I think, but they have it done that way. But another thing in yoga, they talk about how we have this, essentially have the Star of David in us. And I know Adrian touched on this once before, because you have your sacral bones in your body is like an arrow pointing downward. and your spine is so wide at the base that it slowly starts to go up. So you have a triangle pointing up and a triangle pointing down in your body. And I mentioned that once before, and Adrian had said that we have the arrow pointing up in our skull bone. I think he said maybe occipital something rather. Adrian, do you remember what you had said there? I think I saw you were on here, huh? But that's my weird addition about yoga, at least with the triangles and the stars, the triangle, the square, and the star all together. In some of those, it's all in one, right? That's just interesting to me that they have something there. It makes me wonder what that all means. Because I mean, I know chakras, but I don't know what any of that means.
I think there's also an element of, when you look at those pictures on the chakras and you think of the triangle and the square, and then later down the line, the pyramid, there's this idea of going from a two-dimensional shape to a three-dimensional object. And, you know, when you go from 3 sides to 4 sides, that's a type of progression. But when you go from, you know, a two-dimensional image to a three-dimensional shape, that's a different type of progression. So it kind of has this Jacob's ladder vibe in my mind, where you're progressing not just horizontally, but vertically as well. And I think that's, you know, all progression should ultimately be vertical, like, you know, so I just like that.
Jeff, do you mind if I make a comment?
I do not mind.
So, Peter, I actually have had the same thought that in each one of these cycles that are being played out, it's a different level of light that has been revealed, and that culture gets stuck on that level of light, but then eventually falls into apostasy, and their level of light that was restored to them becomes a dead tradition to them. And so when you're talking about going from a single dimension to 3 and 4 dimensions, and then to a prism that is just life-giving, it's just the different levels of light that God is doing his work in that epoch of time or dispensation, is how I've seen it. So thank you for your thoughts on that.
And to go back to Jeff's original question, how do we not repeat the same mistake? How do we not? And I think it's always being open and humble and admitting that we don't know it all. That, you know, I've got a triangle, you bring a square, I'm going to examine it, and it can be different from what I have, but I'm going to explore it for the truth it contains. I don't have to forsake my triangle to look at the square. It just teaches me more about God. And then when you go vertical, it's like, it just blows your mind. I don't know what's after 3, you know, I don't know what 4th dimensions and 5th dimensions look like. I can't even wrap my mind around that kind of thing.
You know, I love this conversation because I've seen the same patterns in the church. We've got stuck with certain ideas, and that kind of damned our progression. And now I've seen within the movement, we have different camps sometimes that really have some favorite doctrines, and yet they're all important. I've found that certain times what's most important is the thing that you're learning at that moment. You know, that's what you have to study. That's what the next step is, the most important step, or the most important wisdom or knowledge that you need. And so the hard thing is, we really, I mean, I know as you ascend, you really enjoy that step and think, man, this is it. This is the view. But if you've ever climbed a mountain before, there's always another hill to climb. So anyway, so.
Yeah, those are all great thoughts. And it seems like, so one of the nice things I like about bringing Jill, you know, explicitly into the conversation is there's a different set of symbols that she has tended to look at to see God through, and it helps me to converse with her to realize that my symbols are not the symbols, right? They're not the only one. And so, you know, you can imagine a very interesting, probably future, but a very interesting missionary work where we go to cultures, and because we have looked through the prism, right? We've looked upward, we've seen what we're supposed to see, we've got a better idea of truth. We will then be able to look at these different symbols or groups of symbols and say, yes, here's what I see that meaning, and they can share it with us, and we can come together on the shared meaning, and then hopefully we can both go together, right? Move forward together, rather than do the pattern where we have done and say, no, but this is it. This is my way. And yeah, Brian, to your point, I feel like we could talk about that for a long time. When Denver started talking about groups and the 10th lecture and, hey, fellowships, a lot of people were like, wait, we left. What about seeking the second comforter? Like, I thought that was so important. And look, the church left it behind, so we can't leave that behind. It feels like every stage we go through as a people, there are some who kind of stop. It's like, no, this, we got to keep this. We have to stay on this, and whatever the issue is, that there are lots of issues that people are willing to, kind of stop and say, no, this is where we should stay. Anyway, hard not to do that. But definitely seems like it's a pattern that we've seen go on. But since we're not going to do that pattern, right, we should keep going.
I noticed another pattern throughout reading this chapter, that it has the waxing and the waning of the people as a whole, right? It throughout the entire story, they're either going forward or they're falling back. There really is no happy medium in that.
Yeah, like my favorite symbol, the tree. You're either growing or you're dying. It's there are only two states.
I think it takes a lot of courage in our life to recognize at times, whether we want to or not, we do slip back. If we're not progressing, we're slipping back. And it takes a gut level honesty to say, I've slipped back this last few weeks, months, whatever, or I'm not where I'd like to be. It's not a beating yourself up with pride thing, because you have to be careful. I think morbid reflection is what it says in AA, but we have to just maintain an honesty with ourselves about our hearts, because I think more than our behaviors, it's where is our heart at this moment? How am I feeling towards God, towards everyone else, towards the truth? So.
Yeah. So to keep going with the parable, and to follow along with what Jill was saying, sciences were advanced, things were written, people were moving forward because of this little symbol of truth that they had, which is amazing, right? Any truth we have, even a little bit of truth, is enough to carry humanity forward giant steps. And however, right, as in all manners, what we already read, people began to question whether others were sufficiently orthodox. So creeds were adopted. The offense against the triangle was offense against God. Men stopped searching for additional insights. And once again, we find a young man. And this young man is a little different than some of the prior young men we've run into. But he is orthodox. He believes earnestly in God, but couldn't quite handle it. What are your thoughts on this young man?
It seems to me that this man is a type of Martin Luther, who is absolutely dedicated, so much so to the religion that he is disgusted at what the leaders are doing with it, at what orthodoxy is considering acceptable, and is trying desperately to get back to the origins, get back to the simplicity even of what it was all founded on.
Mm-hmm.
You
I had
know,
a
go ahead.
um, I had actually that was a this young man, I guess, was something that stirred a lot of my thoughts. I don't necessarily have any conclusion to it, but it definitely prompted a lot of thoughts in my mind. To give a few, on the one hand, there's a lot of, like, I don't know, I'll call them traditional Christian movies that seem to put forth the idea that if you're angry with God, that's the best way to get an answer from him. Like, I could name a few of the movies, but they always show like the prophets in the Old Testament or something, and when they're really, really angry, and that's when God comes through. And I guess my personal experience is that doesn't seem to really be the case. So in that sense, I was like, that's kind of an odd juxtaposition for me, because when I've felt that kind of anger or frustration, those haven't really proven to be, for me, like these big breakthrough moments. It's more like, okay, this is a dead end. I got to turn around and try something else because this isn't going anywhere, kind of a thing. So I thought that was a little bit interesting. And some of it may come from the kind of perspective, like what the wrestle is about, or like who it's really with, and stuff like that. Like, anyway, it prompts a lot of thoughts, because on the one hand, go back to a temple thing, well, removed since I had gone, but I have the thought in my mind, many people could go around and say, oh, if you don't believe this, so we feel very bad for you. Like, as I understand, there was the preacher who says, do you believe in a God who sits on top of a topless throne? And the proper response to that was, I do not. I can't comprehend such a being. And it's like, oh, you feel very bad for you. And at that point, as far as they're concerned, like, you're an atheist. So in that sense, being called like an atheist was actually a part of the path that you'll probably go through. And so, I don't know, it's kind of this odd juxtaposition, like who is angry with who, and what is it really leading to? Anyway, there's a lot more I could say on it, because it stirred a lot within me, but I'm curious to hear what other people have to say with it too.
Yeah, Jacqueline, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you. One of the things that I found helpful in studying the parables is Denver makes mention in a blog post of his of how to have an acceptable sacrament before the Lord. And in that blog post, he gives 10 things that we are to meditate upon when we partake of the bread or the body of Christ. And so I, for the past year, have laid those 10 things on top of these parables as a way for me to look at another facet of it. And the third thing in that list is sacrifice. And what's really poignant to me is that every time a level of light was introduced to mankind through the triangle and the square and then the prism, it required a sacrifice, and it required a sacrifice before the Lord in order to bring that truth down. And so it's taken my mind all kinds of different places, but one is, what if you were to lay these symbols over the books of scripture that have been given to us down through time? So the pyramid being the Old Testament, and the square being the New Testament, and then the prism, or the change for it being, or the pyramid, I'm sorry, being the Book of Mormon, that then you can triangulate between these books of scripture that have been given to us in order to find, because the Book of Mormon gives us keys that unlocks even greater truths in the prior books. So we know that Christ came, and the teachings that he did actually spread more knowledge and light and truth that they had always had in their hands. But because he brought keys to unlock or unconfound their language, it brought about greater truth in that in that cycle. And so that same thing applies to Joseph Smith, and the fact that he brought forth the Book of Mormon with all the keys that unlocks all the prior scriptures. And in those keys is where the prism, or the ability to experience the image of God or the powers of heaven, or all the manifold parts of the powers of heaven, are unlocked because we were given the pyramid, or the fuller nature of God's word. So
you'll have to send us the link to that blog post in the chat if you get a minute.
So Jared, to kind of go back to your questions, what comes to my mind is that, this guy here, he sees, he understands the promises that the triangle represents, and sees the failure of what the result is to deliver what he was hoping for. And in a way, this is a kind of repentance, that he's like, hey, this should be more. This shouldn't be happening. And so what does he do? He ends up taking the pilgrimage that nobody takes anymore. That's a thing of the past. But he returns to the source. He goes back to the original to look at it and to say, hey, what's going on here? There should be more here, and it's at that point when he comes to that point that yes, there actually is more. that's when the new thing is discovered, and so and you kind of see that same realization within him. At first he thought it was blasphemy to kick this thing. But it wasn't. He wanted to go back to the source. Now the relic is just a symbol, but he really wanted to learn more about God, because ultimately the pinnacle of what God was through the triangle was cruel.
But he's looking for God in the dirt. He's looking down and not up. He's looking to the dead and not the living.
Sure, but he's also willing to challenge truth, challenge what he understands as being true, which will detect or reveal what is true and what isn't true. As he's looking down and kicking in the dirt is when he makes the fabulous discovery that there's more there.
Yeah, I mean, every new dispensation is built on the ruins of the last dispensation. Even for all of its failings, that relic was what brought him there. I mean, Martin Luther, in the wreck that the Catholic Church was, when he was alive, that was the foundation that took him to the Bible. Joseph Smith was built off the ruins of Methodism and Presbyterianism. And ruins is a harsh term. I don't want to, get too denouncing. But that's where we always start, is off the testimony of others, unless you're Adam. Or Eve, excuse me.
I have a comment.
That's the microphone.
Sorry, we have a weird setup here because we have multiple people in the room. Just thinking about Martin Luther, he was trying to go back to, he was trying to get back to the original, I guess you could say. Didn't see it with Catholicism or what had happened since Christ was on the earth, maybe trying to get back more towards that. But I can kind of see that same stubbornness, maybe even anger in a lot of us, as we were getting a little disenchanted with the LDS church. I know that before we found Second Comforter or Denver or anything like that, I was just getting really bored at church. Relief Society really drove me crazy. Had a hard time listening to General Conference. I was like, I'm waiting for a Joseph Smith type of prophet to come along where we actually get new revelation and things. But I didn't know what to do about it. Martin Luther was strong enough that he kicked against the pricks, I guess, and made a difference, upset the Catholic world and made a stance. But I can just see a little bit of his personality or his anger, maybe even in a lot of us. And I know that the parable, as you go farther on, it kind of goes more toward our time after Joseph Smith and talks about people trying to get back to an original again, but the same type of attitude I just see in many of us. So.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jared.
I guess I know I'm new to many people and don't really get my background with revealing a little bit, like for whatever it's worth, like when I was having this kind of transition introducing to Denver's kind of ideas and stuff, like while I kind of went that kind of direction, it seems like most of my peers and the group that I happen to fall into had similar-ish things, but generally fell more into the XMO, like Joseph is a pedophile who was a fraud, whatever, and it was like a lot of anger. Like there's a lot of, I don't know, to me, it gets very toxic, I guess. It's like, so I guess that's where, in a sense, I look at that, because I'm like, I mean, for me, it sucks to deal with. Like, it's not something I enjoy or having to, I don't know, because it hits very close to home with many people. So it's like, at what point is that kind of, I guess in this parable, he has like this kind of divine discontent, to borrow like the Abraham kind of phrase. But at what point is there, do you cross over that from divine discontent to just anger, hostility, and where does it become unproductive? Like, how can that be a motivation to do something that can be helpful, but not go into like self-destruct, like just destroy it all, burn it all down kind of a thing? So I don't know, I guess that's part of what I wrestle with understanding how that can be an appropriate motivation, I guess, or how that can stir up having that, what comes out of this, which is a great new perspective on something that wasn't really appreciated before. So anyway, that's.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, Brian, you go, and I'll
summarize. Okay. To me, actually, some of my greatest answers have been when anger, pain, those are the soul's cry within to saying something's not right. I need something. And so when we sometimes even allow ourselves to express our anger, express our hurt and our pain, amazing things can happen if we focus it towards God. I mean, God would rather have us, I mean, this might sound sacrilegious, cuss him out than walk away from him. I've had a lot of friends get angry and they walk away and they don't let him answer. And I found, I mean, it's like sometimes when I was in my worst pain, one time I was literally cussing him out, and words I usually don't use I was using words that was like, wow. And literally the answer came, all of a sudden he started, I mean, I was like, what? Now you're talking? But the answer came that I was finally expressing what was really in my heart, upon my soul, the pain, my search. And then he said, now I can really talk to you, because I was actually being truthful. Instead of, sometimes I prayed a prayer of what I wish I was, instead of praying a prayer. This is where I'm at, God, and I wish that my faith was this big, but it's only this big, and I'm really upset at you that whatever. So it's better to pray in truth, whatever it is, than to walk away from them.
Can I comment? So I think both of these comments, Jared and Brian's comment, I mean, the greatest irony for me in my personal life is I discovered Denver on John DeLynne's Mormon Stories podcast. That's a huge irony. But this young man, he grew in anger until he could no longer remain at peace. He went on a pilgrimage to the ancient triangle relic and kicked it again and again. He did, like you said, Brian, he didn't walk away. He was trying to discover the truth. He was at the source, as close as he could get to it, doing the only thing he could think to do, which was kick it. And I think heaven rewards action, albeit misguided or inappropriate or whatever. If we're sincere in our efforts, God steps in. And so rather than walk away, we need to walk towards him. And I mean, like, as far as cussing him out, he's a big boy. He can handle it. But when we abandon him, then we lose all hope. But when we, even if we're kicking, at least we're there. We're engaging with the Lord. And I think that's the difference. I really do.
Yeah, these are really beautiful comments. And I think it's interesting trying to speak to, because I've been wrestling with this as well. Like, how is anger good? And, I thought anger is bad, and, kind of enter through this. What's interesting to me is the point is made that weeds overgrew it. And so you can, kind of picture this triangle that's mostly overgrown by weeds. And so he goes there, finds it. And maybe it took him a while to find it. Who knows? I don't know. But, he kicks at it and it starts moving. And then he does this. He dug about, after making his discovery, he dug about the triangle. And you think about the imagery of digging about, and again, removing the weeds. And that's a on your knees moment. And of course, we can think back to a very, the most recent parable that we've gotten, where when it came time to build God's house, those that got down on their knees and dug about, removing the weeds to prepare the land, prepare the ground, saw the truth, right? They were able to finally see clearly. And it's interesting that, you think about hands digging, hands in the dirt. If you've ever dug in the dirt, it's hard on your hands if you haven't done it for a while. And so you can just kind of see these. I love how the wise men who knew how to plant, knew how to dig about the soil, who worked with their hands, that, of course, pointing back to Christ, the original, who had these calloused hands. There just seems to be something about digging in the dirt and, working somehow. And of course, there's the humility involved. And maybe that's the big difference, Jared, because, I'm the same. All my friends almost went the same route. And I've had a couple of them tell me, if I had found that Denver guy first, then maybe I would have believed, but they kind of have seen that there's two paths. And for them, they can't go back because Joseph's this evil guy. So can we talk about the square? What are your thoughts about the square? And did anyone have a tough time picturing?
Before we get to the square, and I'll circle back to that. Okay. I love that you pointed out with the hands. On the next page, we're gonna hit that about how wars brought hunger as men neglected their normal responsibilities. Their normal responsibilities were farming and raising food and preparing that. I think there's also a correlation back to Parable 2 with the idea of the telescope, right? The individual that comes forward with a telescope and, here, let me show it to you, and they're going to stand back and judge the method and completely disregard everything. There certainly are layers and connections that cycle through this, and one of the big questions I've got now, getting to the square idea, how can you have a triangle in the dirt that you're going to kick and then start digging about, and you're going to have a triangle and a square, but you're going to go far enough to see those two, but you're not going to realize that it's a three-dimensional object at that point. I haven't yet come to grips with how that happens, and so I'm hoping that some people have some insight there. I mean, clearly it's still incomplete. It's still not any sort of physical, tangible thing at this point. But I'm hoping that there's more there that I just haven't been able to grasp yet.
Yeah, I struggled with this a lot. Thoughts?
So, Cameron, that's how I had pictured maybe it being a three-dimensional object that maybe, the triangle was on the upper side, and then somehow as he kicked it, he kicked up the one side and revealed a couple square corners or something. I mean, that's, I don't know, that's the way I pictured it. But.
No, I'm no artist, but I have a whiteboard behind me. So I think that there's a couple ways of viewing it, right? And one is that the triangle is like this, and you have the grass and the dirt was here, and so if you look at it, if you flip it sideways, then.
So Jeff, most of us can't see what you're doing because you're still showing your screen.
I'm sharing my screen. Well,
yeah.
That is a good point to make. Let's see. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So you have your triangle, you have the grass, and I realize probably you can't see it very well anyway. But my thinking was, there were two thoughts. It was that perhaps there was a square in the ground, right? And so he kicks it, it moves, he starts digging around, and there's a square here. And so it kind of makes like this L shape, right, where the triangle's held up and there's a square base. And for, so it's like, okay, there's a square too, because they didn't deny the triangle. For them, it's like, no, there's the triangle and the square. But for the people that couldn't see the square, they probably just thought, oh, that's just the base. Like that's nothing. That doesn't really count. Thoughts on that? Then there's a whole other different way of viewing it too. But I mean, you have the Phillips idea that it's like this three-dimensional thing. There's lots of ways, which is I think similar to mine, like where if you fill in the boxes, then it's all three-dimensional, right? But you have to like imagine the rest.
A triangle is half a square if you think about it. You divide a square across the diagonal. So if the square was half buried at the diagonal, you have a triangle.
Right. Yep.
Yep. Or if it is, actually a pyramid base.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, bring it up. So I've thought too that it could be that no one was able to see the square even though it was there all along, and towards the end we see the prism that that they're able to see the shapes go into a prism, and I'm not sure that the prism is the final shape in the triangle.
Jeff, this is Jacqueline again. One of the things that I found really fascinating is when you're looking at symbols, the symbol of a triangle is a male symbol that also depicts heaven, and the symbol of the square is to the earth, or also the female. And when you combine the pyramid and the square, or the 3 and the 4 to come up with 7, I think a lot of that could be reckoned back to the Divine Parents talk, when a greater nature of our Heavenly Mother was revealed to us. When and the idea that we need to become little children again and be reborn. And so knowing her and her attributes, her characteristics, and her perfections, along with her as the consort of our Father in heaven, gives us a more correct knowledge so that our faith can be magnified. So I like the idea of that 3 and 4 being connected. And then also in that same symbolism, there's a 5th point in that square where there is the tower that comes out of the center and reaches up to God to make the pyramid. So anyway, thank you for your thoughts.
Yeah. Anyway, I love that there are multiple ways of looking at this. So one other way, and so Jared spoke about this as well, is that you can think of this as a riddle, right? And if you think to the marks right on the garment, you have the compass and the square, and it does say, if we're looking at the words, after making his first discovery, he dug about the triangle and found when another side was exposed, it was not just a triangle, but it was also a square. There are 2 symbols here. And of course, that could be in a couple of different ways. And of course, if you think about it with the temple garments and the symbols there, suddenly, to the point that Jared was making, you can take those symbols and make anything. And if you have those 2 symbols, of course, you could make a pyramid, but you could also make a circle. You can pretty much make anything that you need to build on. And so if it was imagined that this was a triangle because you could only see part of it, but reveals it, it's like, oh, that's a 90-degree angle. And suddenly, it changes the way that you view the whole thing as well. I found that there was a lot of, at least for me, I got a lot of mental mileage off of viewing it that way, because this is just a change in perspective. But of course, with that change in perspective comes a lot.
I'm reminded of that story, or I don't know what a fairy tale or something about the 3 different people, the blind man and the deaf man, and who come to the elephant, and they're asked to describe this elephant, and the blind man describes it by by what he feels, and the deaf man describes it by just what he sees, and the different facets of looking at the same thing. All of it is part of the truth. All of it is, like you said, looking at different angles of it. But as soon as you expose just a little bit more, then suddenly your entire perspective shifts. And it's not that what you were looking at before was wrong. It's just that you've added to it, and you've looked at it from a new set of eyes or from a different angle. But all of the triangle was still part of the prism, and the square was still part of the prism. They were just different sides of it.
So it seems like it's so obvious to look and see how much more full the greater understanding is. Why then is it so difficult for the majority to understand it, recognize it, or accept it?
Complacency. Nobody else would have seen the square hidden or the prism because they didn't look. They just saw the triangle and thought that was it, and didn't think to pursue that any further.
And remember all the books and the dissertations and everything that was written just about the triangle? Imagine what could be written about the prism.
And I think, too, a lot of it comes down to fear, honestly. When people have an orthodox dogma, there's a great deal of fear, not about going against it, but fear that what you've put all your hopes in may turn out to be a lie, that people can't handle cognitive dissonance. And so they would rather kill than accept that they might be wrong, which is why religion is the bloodiest business on earth, and why people go to war and kill repeatedly throughout history over religion. You know, you're going to accept my God or I'll kill you. No, you'll accept my God or I'll kill you. It's all fear.
Yeah, it's it's like what's going on right now. The quote is in the parable, this idea of grace symbolized by the square is dangerous, threatening safety and harmony, they claimed. Wars were fought to protect the peace. Just like, you know, we're killing people to protect people from dying. So I haven't been looking at the chat too much, but yeah, Kevin, do you want to speak about that? You brought up looks like you brought up the heptagram. You want to talk about that really quick? Because that's another way of looking at this.
I'm not sure he's got a microphone that works or is in a situation or position that he can be verbal.
Okay. Good deal. Well, so then to bring his thoughts for those who are listening to the recording, if they're just listening to it, there's this idea that, well, there's a couple ideas. You know, one is that God's perspective is different than ours, right? It's higher than ours. Peter Morkel talked about seeing a fourth dimension, and I can't claim to do that well. But what's interesting is in a fourth dimension, nothing is hidden for us. Like everything in the 3D world would be visible. And so just like for a 3D person looking at the two-dimensional world, you know, if you draw a circle and put something inside the circle, someone outside the circle in the 2D world would just see a wall, and they could walk all the way in the wall and they couldn't see inside. But for the 3D world, we can see inside the two-dimensional world. Nothing that's in 2 dimensions can be hidden from us. And so it's the same way if you go up a notch, you know, up a level to the 4th dimension, you can look and you can see everything. You can see inside of all of us at the same time. And so if you're thinking about that with these symbols, what we're trying to intuit is we're trying to take this 3-dimensional world, right, or this little symbol and go the other way around, right? We're trying to go up a level. And it's hard to do, right? It's hard to see inside what we can't see.
Well, and kind of reminds me of this concept that all things are present before God, that, you know, time is measured only unto man. Like, I cannot wrap my head around that. Like, as much, it's fascinating to think about, but when you live in linear time, that is so difficult to even comprehend. It's awesome, but it's hard to comprehend.
Yes. Yeah.
No, well, I keep on thinking that. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, specific what Kevin is talking about is a 7-pointed star that can be drawn without lifting up the pen. That hasn't. It's a symbol that may have significant meaning that has not yet been co-opted by any major group that dictates what it could mean. And I think Kevin pointed that out because of some work that he's doing on the scripture committee and with the layouts of the scriptures, that I don't recall if that symbol or that icon is found in the current print versions that we can get on Amazon, but it is found in the leather edition. And I've got it here on my computer. I'll see if I can grab it and share it with people, or at least some type of it, unless you've got it there, Jeff.
I'll stop sharing if you want to share your screen.
Jeff, I just sent it to you in a text. One of the options in a text.
Well, I could share this screen then.
Yeah, it looks similar to that. The icon that's found in the scriptures, it's found, don't hold me to it, I'm going off of memory, but I want to say at the end of the Book of Mormon and at the end of the New Testament. So on both books in the New Covenants. Kevin, maybe you can elaborate that that's actually it. And if you don't have it to share, Kevin, then I'll grab something and share it.
Kevin posted that Denver drew it on the board for the Scriptures Committee as a symbol to close each book of the Restoration Edition Scriptures. So I don't know.
Yeah, and all I know, I was curious. I had heard about it and was curious. I went and did some digging with another project I'm involved in that I want to say at the end of the Old Covenants, there's a different icon, and at the end of at the end of Teachings and Commandments, there's a leaf icon suggesting a living volume that will continue to grow. So I think that there are different icons in the actual print versions, but there are icons at the end of the volumes.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, and you know what's fun about this is there are ways to combine these two symbols, right? If we're looking at where, back in the parable, they finally, and after, of course, there were wars, hunger, people neglected the responsibility of the farm, like Cameron mentioned, hunger, disease. At length, people lost the virility to fight, and they decided it was God's will to punish them for their intolerance. And I love that phrase. During this peace born from exhaustion, men began to discuss the interplay between the triangle and the square with an openness not possible before. So there's still two sides. They're still opposed to each other. And, this is what happens when we're opposed to each other, is we can't really see how the two could be combined in a great way because we're opposed, right? And you can kind of think of that stance and how that looks with one leg back and, your dominant leg's back. You're holding back. And so it seems like both sides were holding back, so they weren't able to see how these could be combined until there's another young man. And I will read this first little paragraph and then we can talk about it. One day there was another young man who searched into the competing views of the Triangularists and the Reformers, who proclaimed God's grace in the square as well. He could not decide which was right. On a beautiful spring morning, he caught a glimpse of light, which clarified his thinking. Without the benefit of having read any of the libraries about the triangle or the square, the young man said he recognized in these symbols another higher principle. He claimed to see in them the pyramid. He began to teach, a pyramid is both a triangle and a square. It is the only square with the center point fixed by the triangle of its sides. The center point aimed upwards was the great symbol of God's house. When in times past God met with men, he did so on the mountains. All truths can be encompassed within the shape of the pyramid.
I've been attending a non-denominational church, and of course you have the one I'm attending, it's all about God's grace is how you're saved. And then you have other denominations that are saying it's by works you are saved. And the symbol of the pyramid, and Joseph Smith, what he did, he brought that all together into one. And it takes both to do that. And he brought all these truths together, and instead of just each of the sides having part of it, he could bring it all together with the revelations that he received. And we see that now today with Denver bringing even more of that truth and pointing us to heaven and to Christ. And our hearts and minds are now looking upward. And I liked when Denver said, when we pray, why are we looking down when we pray? Why aren't we looking up when we pray? And that always stuck to me. And of course, we know the young man is Joseph Smith, and it all started with the first vision. So,
could the young man also be Denver? Did he not also receive on a beautiful spring day light and knowledge from an angel? Perhaps the Lord. Wasn't that when he was told that his mission would begin, his ministry would begin? It was in March. And I'm wondering if it also could be an interpretation of what bringing together what Joseph Smith did, which expounded on the triangle by creating the square, and then also bringing together the triangle to create the prism that ultimately leads everybody to God, encompassing all truth. Because we know that Joseph Smith started the restoration, but he didn't finish it. And he was able to restore some truth, but not all of it. And we have somebody now who is able to point us in more complexity and more depth to God. That's how I saw it.
So I'm just sharing the symbol here, the star, the 7-pointed star heptagram as is found in the scriptures for your GWiz files. I'll let Kevin talk about what it means. By all means, keep going, Jeff.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know if Kevin was going to jump in. There,
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Just, I guess one thing in various situations, whether it's the square or now the pyramid thing, it just reminds me, there's a verse that kind of says it like this, that basically to be a peacemaker is to be able to take two things and make them one. And you see that kind of thing happening throughout this parable when there's an opportunity to take something where there's division and make it one. And where ultimately the restoration, where it's headed, is to have all things become one. So,
I think it's interesting that to me is like one of the challenges that heptagram you showed was different stages of the week of a creation cycle. And I think in a lot of ways, we're each in different days of the cycle sometimes, and you get a couple of us together and we're arguing over what day it is. And for me, it might be Thursday, and for another person, it might be Monday, but in their current creation cycle. So again, it's like, why I think Joseph wouldn't, I think, Denver said that he doesn't challenge when people have, in their particular path, he lets them kind of learn. We all kind of need to let each other be where we're at too. I mean, it's like we can gently share a thought, or try to share our path or the truth that as we see it. But I think sometimes we just fight too much over things that we don't need to fight over.
I wanted to make a comment about the shapes, if I could. When you take two triangles, as has been pointed out, you get the Star of David, an Aaronic symbol for a time when they had the lesser priesthood. Two squares overlaying one another is the seal of Melchizedek, perhaps symbolizing something higher or more complete, certainly in this parable. The idea of a square base with triangular sides making a pyramid, somebody mentioned about the symbols of the compass and the square. And indeed, you have the square and then the punctus, or the point, which is triangulated by the 4 triangular sides and sets the point in space in the center of the square. If a compass is placed there, then you can circumscribe a circle perfectly within that square using that point. And so the compass and the square lead to all kinds of symbolism. But then you get to a 3-dimensional pyramid, which ultimately is a prism. A prism is designed to receive and separate light into its levels or bands, levels of progression, for example. And that is symbolic to me of what a Urim and Thummim would be. The Urim and Thummim that Joseph had was described as 2 3-pointed diamonds. If you think about what that looks like, you overlay them and you have a Star of David, or you have 2 what's called tetrahedrons. I don't want to get into all the geometry of it, but the point is that one pointing up, one pointing down, 3 sides on each representing past, present, and future. The idea that the prism was something that the Joseph Smith character conveyed and related to the notion of a temple in this parable, where not only can you receive light from God, but ultimately you should know him, is a far distance from a one-dimensional picture of a triangle. And so these geometric shapes, I think, are fascinating in their progression. Ultimately, the parables are an endowment, starting where we are and coming to know God face to face. So is the progression of these various geometries.
Well, our mic's off. So the 2 triangles superimposed over each other, making the Urim and Thummim, just reminds me of when Denver spoke about the chiasms, and you have a triangle with the point pointing upward to God, and then another one pointing downward, which would be us. And in the middle then is that, I don't know, that space. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I was just reminded of the chiasm between the upward pointing
God reaching down and us reaching up.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of beauty in just thinking about these symbols and what they mean and how they interact. To your point about the Urim and Thummim, here at the bottom he says, each one of us must have and use the prism, the light, the perfection which alone comes from God. And was that it?
And lights and perfections, that's what Urim and Thummim is in Hebrew.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was great, guys. Adrian, I love hearing that symbolic reference and trying to put all that together in my mind. I've been thinking a lot since I've been sitting here, and a lot of things have been going through my mind. But when we had gone over this thing in our fellowship, and I wanted to get a jump on everything, so I go on YouTube and I start looking up triangles and I start looking up pyramids, because I remember Denver said that the great pyramids in Egypt were there prior to the flood. So, I thought, well, how would that be? And, then he sort of referenced the temple. So, I started thinking about temples and pyramids, and then it talked about prisms. So I started looking up prisms, and, prisms refract light. Light comes in and it gets bent and it goes out. So as I was thinking about the prism, I was looking at these symbols and making them symbols, just like what we're kind of cautioned not to do with the parable, is not make these symbols into our God. So it just kind of dawned on me when I was thinking about the prism and the light refracting in the prism, is that, as we pick up a prism and we look at it, we can see all the colors in it. It's very beautiful, and it can bring light into it. Then I started thinking about myself as a prism, and how great it would be if God's light could come into me and be refracted out to other people. That seems to be, in my mind, the greatest purpose that the light could have. And that's kind of how I graduated from thinking of a symbol versus thinking of myself as the actual prism refracting that light.
I love that. And the idea of the Urim and Thummim, I mean, the phrase lights and perfection is actually used on page 24, which I identified in my reading as the midpoint of a chiasm in this parable, which is there's a lot of repetition. You're going to have a lot of couples, a lot of paired ideas that are shared. And on page 24, when talking about the mob approaching at the beginning of one paragraph, and then the next paragraph it talks about the mob. He was killed by a mob shortly after his sermon ended. If you look at that, those are 2 points talking about a mob that you can then focus in towards the middle point. You're going to have just after the mob, you're going to have talking about a symbol intended to show us more. And then on the opposite side, the opposite leg of the chiasm, you're going to have a symbol of God's communication with us. And right in the middle, the sentence reads, "It was always intended to be directed upward toward heaven, from where all light and perfection comes." And Lisa, I think your point about how things need to flow through us, I think that this is a midpoint, a key idea that really hits home for me anyway, that yeah, we as individuals need to be connected to heaven and allowed to flow through us the light and perfection, the knowledge and the intelligence from heaven, that we can be an example to others. And I think that is a key point that's being drawn to in this, with this chiasm. And I suspect, I haven't really been able to study it all out more, I suspect there are probably other chiasms in this, specifically because the idea of the triangle up and the triangle down is represented as two chiasms, if you will. And so I expect there's more here. I wonder if anybody else has come across other chiasmic qualities of this parable.
This is Brad. I don't know if this is the right place to make this comment, but when I read the parable, when you were talking, Cameron, about us being the prism, was Joseph the young man? Of course. Is Denver the young man? Of course. The real question is whether we're going to be the young man, because the historical rerun that's in here, as it goes from the Trinity to the Reformation to the Restoration, and then of course it ends with the subtle challenge: are we going to redo history? So going back to like Jeff's question of how do we not let this happen in our group, the only piece I've found is the predetermine, if it's somehow useful. Predetermine, I'm staying with Christ, I'm staying with Joseph, I'm staying with the Book of Mormon, I'm staying with Denver because he teaches the truth, and I want to be that young man. And so I know that's not exactly deep doctrine secret, but there's power in predetermining that, because if you look at the parable, the persecutors start to say, oh, he's gone too far, the young man's gone too far. Are we prepared for deeper light and truth when the young man Denver goes too far and we can't handle it? Are we going to be part of the 10 little Indians? I mean, a lot of times being in this movement, it's like being part of 10 little Indians, and another one just got killed off. And so I tried to predetermine I would like to not get killed off because my faith can't handle it. And so to wrap up this comment, in case it makes any sense, I believe there's power in predetermining that I don't understand, we don't understand, we're going to get stretched. And it's actually a sign and a key decision whether we become a persecutor at that moment, betray the covenant, and fall away. Or we predetermine I'm going to stretch and just since I'm blabbing, I have this silly little thing called the Snuffer assumption, which is when he says something I don't get and something I initially disagree with, my Snuffer assumption is that he understands a whole bunch of things I don't. And so that helps me go back to my predetermination to stay on this path. So I hope that was useful somehow.
Hey, can I jump in and make a comment real quick? I'm at work, and so I haven't been able to listen to everything that's said tonight. But the first thing I got to say is I love you people. I love the comments that you all had to say, and I love being a part of this group. Something that's like really been sticking out in my mind about this story is I honestly can see like comparing myself to each person in this parable. At times I've been every single one of these people, and one of the things that I've really gotten, and it sticks out in the first parable that we studied, is why can't we be content with the Lord? Why can't I be content with the Lord? And it's really interesting since we studied that it showed itself in the scriptures so often. When Nephi is getting ready to die, and he's got to find somebody else to fill this spot of the king for the people. And so often I feel like we get caught up in that dance of always needing that king to direct us, to give us, instead of, like that first parable says, of being content with the Lord to be our king. And the reason I'm saying that is just because in this parable, if you look at it, like how many times did the people get into these bickerings and these arguments over things when, if they were content with the Lord and their relationship with him, all of those things don't matter. And that's been one thing that I've realized in this. I mean, I've been right there. I've got in these jarrings and contentions with people over beliefs, and I'm a highly opinionated individual, I know, but that's the thing, is it all could have been avoided with just being content with the Lord. And I kind of feel like that's what these symbols means. That's what the symbol of God is. It's being content with him, being content with each other, and that way, like all of the arguments, all of the different disagreements, they just kind of vanish away. I just wanted to throw that out there real quick.
That's a beautiful thought. I really appreciated all the thoughts so far. We haven't talked much about God's house as a symbol. Is that maybe just because it's so obvious that it's a temple, mountain, now temple? This is where you go to find God. Has anyone kind of taken that symbol a little bit deeper prior to jumping to the prism? Because that's, my mind likes to jump to that one too, because it's the most fun. But other thoughts on the prism?
Jeff, I have a thought. This is McKay. When you look at light, sunlight, it looks like it's just one thing, It doesn't look like 7 colors. It just looks like one. And the light coming down from God, now metaphorical light, the knowledge coming down from God, will raise some of us up to the first heaven and others to the second, and so on through the seventh. And it's all the same light. The scriptures suggest that if we are willing to receive light and live by that light, there's no limit to the light God will give us. And it will raise some of us up to one heaven and some to a higher. It's interesting that the prism will refract it into red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. 7.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thought. There's so much here, right? So the pyramid being God's house, it being the thing that can encompass both of the great symbols of God. It's interesting to look at the progression of the symbols, because the triangle was to reach up to and seek the approval of God, which you can even take that to the Jews, right? This is like the Pharisaical, these are the things you have to do. And then you can think of Paul, and Paul's argument was more, oh, God's grace is good for the whole world. It's interesting that we've now paralleled them in the same way with the Catholic Church, and then the Reformation kind of paralleled the early stages of Christianity. So that's already gone through 2 rounds. And then now we're here with the LDS Church. You see this happen a third time, where the Brigham side of the church, or right, the Brigham branch, or the Hiram branch, if we're being, who owned it for a while. The Hiram branch was different than the Joseph branch, right? The Hiram branch was more hierarchical, much more the triangle side, whereas the Joseph branch was much more the square, the grace. You read some of what Joseph Smith III preached and talked about and did, and he brought people in. There were lots of different, and yet, right, each one of those 3 rounds never really got there, because as soon as the prism was built, as soon as the pyramid was built, that allowed. What's interesting is according to the parable, well, I'll just read it. The young man and his followers built a pyramid of their own as a new symbol of God. As they did so, the young man claimed to see more light and say, I see now the great symbol is not only a triangle and a square and a pyramid, but it is also a prism. And as has been said by a few people, better than I can, it's meant to refract light. It's meant to be a tool. It's meant to magnify our sight and can concentrate the heat of the sun. It can improve our lives. It's the great symbol of a living God. There's more here than even just seeing, right? There's an idea that this light can be used to improve the way we live, not just our beliefs and making sure our beliefs are orthodox or more comprehensive about God. But just as the triangle improved the world and the square improved the world, and the pyramid, it seemed like, had it been given time, would have improved the world. This idea of the prism can do so much more so. And it's just that seems to be the beauty of God, where what he reveals improves all things that it touches, right? It's not just one side. We will be living a different way, a higher way that I think we can comprehend, because we can't see it yet. We haven't yet built a pyramid of our own. So I don't think we haven't been able to see how to concentrate the heat of the sun the right way, right? How to magnify our sight. There are things yet to be seen, besides the obvious, at least for me, which was to see the Lord, right? The second comforter idea.
So building on your question about the pyramid being a temple, and how much truth or knowledge can be transferred there, I'm reminded of many of the remarkable traits of the pyramid at Giza, the Great Pyramid, even, that has so much mathematical, astronomical significance, even applying to our own world. There's so much knowledge there that we've been able to go and overlay it back onto it and say, oh, well, I mean, yeah, there's all these scales and all of these measurements and weights and things that clearly are important. Imagine the knowledge that was conveyed there by the builders, by those that were actually using it for the specific purpose of either teaching or expressing or preserving core important knowledge. I wonder if the day will come when even more is given, even about something that's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, that we haven't understood because we haven't known how to understand it yet. I think that there's significance in a temple. I mean, yeah, God can use a mountain as a temple. God can use the world around us to teach us about himself. And I think that, yeah, as a symbol, the pyramid is a symbol of his house, but ultimately it's still just a symbol. It's still just a representation. It's not actually his house. It's his house when he comes to teach us there. And that should be the goal. The goal shouldn't be to create a perfect symbol or to create something that's going to perfectly reflect what our understanding is of him. Our goal should be to build something that he can come and claim as his own and teach us a perfect understanding of who he, or really they, who they are.
Yeah. Yes. And that's the progression that you see in this pyramid as well, because at first, when it's first meant and seen as a prism, it's used to focus downward, right? And it can improve our lives. If we were willing to live equally, and even just the small thing, if we were able to get each other out of debt, then that would take away one of the shackles that many people are under, paying interest, right? And being in bondage. And you can use the scriptures, you can use the truths that we are given in so many ways to improve what we're doing here. But to your point, Cameron, it feels like the ultimate, right? The ultimate is to then turn that upwards and to understand God. And right, and what's ironic is that, this is the lectures on faith, right? To understand him, and as you come to understand him, then you understand what must be done to live like him, or to live like them. And so you can do that, right? And this is exactly what he says. I love that progression.
Well, one of the things that Denver said was that we had to gather as a people, and one of the purposes of the new covenant is that there's things that we can only learn as a people, that we can't learn as individuals. And that one of the purposes of the temple was for us as a people to learn those things that are hidden from us as individuals. And I thought that was a very important point, that it rang true to me that when he said that.
Yeah, I like that. So as we wrap up, I want to see if people have thoughts connecting the different parables. And as we get into that, I wanted to bring in the grips, the hand grips from the temple as well. If you go from the triangle to the square to the pyramid to the prism pointed downward to the prism pointed upwards, right? You have these 5 stages. 5 is a really interesting number in a lot of ways. Among other things, to me, and Jacqueline and I have been talking about this week, but I've often see 5 as what we can do, right? Because we have our hand, right? But we know that that's not complete. And so 5 is also what God can do. And you can kind of see there's grace and there's works with hands and putting hands together. But if you have, to Tasha's, that what she brought up, the hand reaching down, the hand together, reaching up, right? Then you have 10, and 10 is this idea of completion and perfection. If you can remember what those grips were like, it's like the symbols, where the first one is very weak, right? It's a weak grip, and the second one is stronger. The third one is stronger still, and the last one, of course, is this powerful grip that can pull you through heaven, pull you through the veil. And you think of those, the triangle, the square, the pyramid, and then the prism. You have the 4, right? Each is getting stronger because it's allowing you to see more of God, to see more of what's behind there. Denver talked a little bit about in one of his blog posts. He said, this is the beginning. It's the first step. When the Lord first takes hold of your hand, it's a faint grip, a partial contact, a weak beginning. It is the token, however, that everyone must first receive. It comes from obeying and then acting faithfully in what has been shown to you. It requires you to sacrifice your own will to the Lord's. Anyway, it's very exciting to see where we are and to know what's coming next for us, because we're getting to the pyramid stage, and it's beautiful. Sorry, so that was kind of my last concluding thought on that. I have a couple of thoughts on linkages between the parables. What have you thought about? Where are we at right now?
So oh yeah, go ahead, Jared. Did you want to say something?
Please, you go.
Okay. All right. So one thing I think to remember in the parable, that it was in defining what the different shapes meant that always ended up dividing the people. And it was interesting at the end that it said God expects us, some said, which I think this relates perfectly to us, God expects us to be one and therefore must be displeased when we lack uniformity. But, said others, without the freedom to find God in our own lives, we are no different than the traditionalists. Surely our new faith stands for modern communication with God, or it stands for nothing. The growing controversy within the new tradition in the wilderness was in danger of following the same dangerous paths as the earlier triangularists. Men are alike even if they follow beliefs which are unalike. And I think this is the thing for us. I think it's great to think about symbolism and all the things that different things could mean. But ultimately, the purpose of the symbolism is to create a connection with God individually, which then brings us together. He brings us together. Like we've mentioned before, Zion, we don't have a blueprint for Zion, so it can only be Him that orchestrates this craziness between all of us. And I love on page 24, it says, in the middle, it says, the symbol we have been given has always been the great symbol of God's communication with us. We are meant to talk with God Himself. Each one of us must have and use the prism, the light, the perfection which alone comes from God. And so while I think that there's a value in talking about, the different shapes and all the things that they could mean, I think ultimately, if we lose the purpose of the shapes, if we lose the purpose that the shapes aren't the purpose, then we lose sight of what they're trying to point us to. They become our idols. And I think just the very last paragraphs are great warnings for us to remember. Like, those two things are so noble. We need to be as one, and we need to have freedom to also, think for ourselves. And it's only through God that each one of us connect with Him that we are connected together. And so anyway, I think that's a great warning, and it's good for us as a people to remember.
I definitely see these parables as being connected together as well. Them building upon each other. I see the first one with the busy young man. That was the Lord working directly with an individual. Making a net, casting it wide. Each one of us has the opportunity to rise up and try to come to know the Lord. And I see that one as being more of an individual thing and a collective thing, collecting the individuals to come together, to be in fellowships and to start to learn how to work together. And then you get to the wise men, where you have the fellowships, you have the communities of people learning to work together, trying to figure out their crap, trying to seek wisdom in their breaking down of arguments, proving their points, contending, those kinds of things, which are necessary in order for us to break down our pride and scale back to basic fundamental truths. And so I see the second parable of the wise men as more of a collective thing, that the community needs to root itself in God, in truth. And then we see this parable where now those truths are going to be expounded upon, and we have prophets who have the ability to help us increase our knowledge. We have the ability to go to God directly and learn more, gain more light and understanding, ultimately leading to the building of Zion, the building of a temple, for us collectively to rise up to know God. So far I see each one building upon the previous.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Go ahead.
I see some correlations also to other parables, or at least one specific one about build a house. And I mean, talk about a pyramid and that being a symbol of the house of God. There's another parable we received that talks about, you know, when a people are given a command to build a house, how they respond, what they do, how they treat each other, and how they in some cases abuse one another because of their different ideas, understandings, perspectives, whatever it may be, desires even to try and fulfill the command. And there's a story there about how it can actually get accomplished, and working together. I think there's some cautions about, you know, how we treat one another, and where our conflicts are, where's our friction amongst ourselves, and where's the combative spirit that creeps up among us from time to time about ideas and prejudices for how we think we need to move forward, that may or may not be accepted or agreed upon by the group as a whole. I think there's a lot to learn about patience, tolerance, compassion, long suffering from this parable that is wise. I think we see some of that in the wise men. I think we see some of that in the young man at the side of the road braiding rope. He had to learn the tolerance and the patience, the long suffering. I think that these are virtues that are being taught, and they're important for us to let them become part of who we are in order to move forward towards the ultimate goal.
Amen, Cameron. I had two comments. One was, got the other one for now. Just to say what Cameron was saying, the great competition and these parables all do relate to each other. And I thought this parable has a lot about opening up our minds, our thinking, being able to learn to live more peacefully. And in the great competition parable, there's a sentence in there, I'll read it. Before making you all kings and queens with me, I needed to have a people who would live in peace together. Immortality without peace among us would be a great punishment and not a great prize. I think as we grow and ascend, we are still complex beings. We have eternal lives of complexity behind us. And so we do need a talent and ability to live peacefully and to allow each other their space to grow. So anyway, I do think every one of these parables have both individual ascension topics and characteristics and attributes, and also a community focusing both on Zion and the individual.
So if I can go back a little bit. That a thing that maybe you even want to come on and say anything was. Sorry, are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. When I watched the one about when you're doing the first one, it's like it was post, but I had my hand raised, like, oh, this is my total thing that I get from the whole man braiding rope and creating the net thing, which even at the time, if I go back to our experience with the whole scripture committee and all that kind of stuff, I guess to me, part of what happened in that parable was like when he's focusing on, okay, what we really, really need to do is make the perfect net. But then at the end of the day, the net caught its fill when he just came to know the Lord. And it wasn't that they were going to go use the net in some magnificent way or something. The purpose wasn't to make the net. It was the process of doing that. And I guess to me, the task of doing the whole scripture committee, applying that to what went on there, I mean, in a way, it's so ironic because I guess I see it like the whole children of Israel, God then put the law on stone tablets because they didn't have it in their hearts, and the stone representing that their hearts were hard. And yet we were given this task to come up with scriptures, and yet if the goal wasn't actually to come up with what are the perfect set of scriptures, but what if it really was, can we be Christ-like with each other? And whatever falls out of that would have been completely fine. That it didn't have to be like we need the perfect, arrangement of what we agree on for the intro or whatever, all that kind of stuff. It's just, can we be Christ-like in our interactions with each other? And perhaps we're given some time now before some other task or whatever it might be given, but I'm not sure it even matters what that task is. Like if it's build a barn or build a house or whatever, it's like, can we just be given any kind of assignment and be Christ-like with each other while we do it? And whatever happens at the end of that, I think would be great, even if it's like a barn that has a door that's tilted or something. It's like, I don't know that has to be perfect. It's just, can we be Christ-like in how we interact with each other? Because if that law is written in our hearts, then I think we can accomplish anything, really.
Yeah, that's a beautiful comment. Lots of good comments have been made. Another link that came across that builds, I think, on Jared's point is that, whenever the master is involved, there's always weaving together. And, of course, with the rope to the net, that's obvious. With the wise men, they're the two friends, neighbors, people whose land touched, who are brought together because of the wisdom and the insight that was given. Just like with the second young man who's able to say, oh, this and this, they go together and they can make this also. It just seems like that is one of God's great gifts. And maybe that's the female side more than the male side, but the ability to weave together people who are, ropes, which are individually fine, but, weave together the strands, bring people together who are maybe fighting, and then, here, bring together the different ways that we see God. I guess I used to worry a lot more about are we one mind enough? Because it seems like if we can just get enough light, that will work its way out. We just have to focus on the other side, right? And trying to become a one heart, and to Jared's point, not maybe worrying about too much about what the individual task is at hand, but trying to work through that to get closer.
I don't know if this was said earlier, but one thing that I really thought was interesting in this was everything in the whole parable is about orthodoxy and like a certain foundation of religion or whatever. And finally at the end, the first time, this young man at the end is the only time it doesn't mention the Orthodox behind that name, those uniformed beliefs, correlated beliefs, I guess you could call it. But I just thought that was really interesting, because I think to make this work, to make this happen, like, we've got to completely be unorthodox and step away from, in addiction and recovery, it was put this way. Sometimes when you're going through the recovery process, you tend to have your page all filled up. You know everything. I know all there is to know, and so like I'm going to be just fine in this. But sometimes it takes actually just crumpling up that page that you already have filled out, throwing it away, and just allowing the Lord to write a new one.
I think it's an interesting precursor to the parable next week, the horses of Shiloh, and what people think versus what the reality is. Be another interesting discussion, I'm sure, and another tie-in.
Yep. Well, great. Well, thank you, everyone. I quoted a scripture. I think it's from Peter. Talks about how I'll end with that. It says, "And besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to your virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. For if these things are in you and abound, they make you that you shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But he that lacks these things is blind and cannot see afar off, and has forgotten that he was purged from his old sins." I like that idea of being able to see, because that's another thing that we see, right? The young man noticed the man sitting over here. Someone else had the telescope, which Cameron mentioned. And here, of course, there's the prism. May we all be able to see better because of what we're going through. And thank you, Cameron, for organizing this, and everyone for being here.
Amen, Jeff. Thank you for stepping up and leading the discussion. I think this has been absolutely wonderful. And so I think we'll close here.